Podium Audio presents A Whisper of Death, Book 1 of Raven and Wren, written by Darcy Burke, performed by Raphael Corkhill and Tamsin Kennard.
Prologue. London, January 1868. Frost had formed on the lampposts as Hadrian Becket, Earl of Ravenhurst, strode away from Westminster toward Whitehall. He had a meeting with an inspector at Scotland Yard about the Clerkenwell explosion and the Fenians. The air was chilled, but thick with the ever-present fog that clung to the streets at this time of year. Hadrian pulled his hat down closer to his ears, regretting that he hadn't taken the scarf his valet had pressed upon him earlier that afternoon. But Hadrian had been in a hurry to get to Westminster. There weren't many people about at this late hour, nearly midnight, but the streets weren't empty either. Hadrian kept his attention rapt as he surveyed the area while he walked. It wouldn't do to be surprised by a footpad. A boy came toward him, dirty-faced, his dark eyes round and hollow. "Halfpenny for me younger siblings, Governor?" That slight distraction was all it took. A hand gripped Hadrian's right shoulder from behind, tightly, viciously. Turning his head, Hadrian saw a man, his hat pulled low over his brow and a scarf covering most of his face. He pulled at Hadrian's outer garments, just enough to expose his side. Hadrian caught the flash of a knife as it flicked toward him, slicing just beneath his ribcage. The blade was long and sharp, neatly piercing Hadrian's clothing and his flesh. Pain flashed, but he didn't think of it. He clasped the man's wrist while the knife was still embedded in his side. Hadrian pivoted. The man was a few inches shorter than Hadrian's 6'2", and thick and muscular. A grey scarf covered his neck and the lower half of his face, leaving just his dark, narrowed eyes exposed. The ruffian had been smarter than him, it seemed, in more ways than just guarding against the cold. The man's gaze swept over Hadrian's face, then lifted to meet his eyes. Surprise registered briefly. Did the brigand know him? Hadrian had never seen him before. But his eyes were now emblazoned in his mind. Angry and desperate to free himself, Hadrian tightened his grip on the man's wrist. The ruffian twisted the blade. Hadrian sucked in air as a pain he couldn't ignore shot through him. He had the sense to cry for help, his panicked voice thundering in the night. Someone would hear him. He wasn't that far from Westminster. The man withdrew the knife from Hadrian's flesh, but Hadrian wouldn't release him. He would know why this man wanted to kill him. The villain tried to pull away. "Let go!" Growling, his eyes now furious, he kicked his leg against Hadrian's calves and pushed him forward. Hadrian had nowhere to go but down. He fought to keep hold of the man's hand, but it was futile. In the end, he fell to the cobblestones. Unable to get his hands in front of him to break the fall, his head hit the rough stone. Agony exploded in his head, forcing Hadrian's eyes closed. A terrible weakness spread through him, along with a helplessness. As darkness descended, he realized he had something in his hand, something that didn't belong to him. He managed to shove it into his pocket as he gasped for breath. Then he moved his hands to the wound in his side, where thick, sticky blood flowed freely. Anger coursed through Hadrian as he fought to remain conscious. This was not the way things were supposed to end. Murder would not be his fate. However, he couldn't keep the shadow from claiming him. He drifted softly and infuriatingly easily into the abyss. Chapter 1. 1 week later. "Sharp!" Hadrian's valet, a solidly built man in his middle 30s with grey eyes that assessed every aspect of a person in an effort to see how he could be of service, hastened toward the bed where Hadrian was struggling to sit up. "Yes, my lord." "I'm bloody tired of lying abed. I'm going to the sitting room." It was a short walk, as it adjoined his bedchamber, but it would be the longest distance he'd traversed since he was stabbed. "The doctor did say to take things very slowly," Sharp cautioned, his thin mouth turning down. "What if you just sat in that chair there?" He gestured towards the chair beside the bed where Sharp, his mother, the butler, and a few other people, including the inspector from Scotland Yard who'd visited yesterday, had perched, whilst gazing worriedly at Hadrian. Except the inspector. He hadn't appeared concerned or even that interested in being there, truth be told. "No, thank you." Hadrian added the last through gritted teeth. He hadn't been a very good patient, but lying about and sleeping for hours upon hours grated him horridly, even if he did need it. Honestly, his head had hurt so badly following the attack that sleeping was the only relief. "To the sitting room, if you please." He swung his legs to the floor. Sharp hurried to help him, grabbing his arm, but Hadrian waved him away. "Just fetch my banyan, please." "Of course." Sharp went to the other side of the bed, where Hadrian's dark blue silk banyan lay. Fetching the garment, the valet returned to help Hadrian into it. Standing, Hadrian felt a rush of satisfaction, along with a pull in his side, where a neat row of stitches kept his knife wound closed, and a sharp throb in his head. Blast, but the head injury was worse than the wound in his side, though donning the banyan made his side hurt more than his head for a brief moment. Sharp brought a pair of slippers, which Hadrian pushed his feet into. Taking a deep breath, Hadrian shuffled towards the sitting room, feeling with every step that he aged a year, or that he'd aged years as a result of the attack and was somehow 40 instead of 30. Damn it, but that made him angry. The entire event was infuriating. Why on earth would a footpad, which was what the inspector had concluded Hadrian's assailant to be, stab him and not steal anything before running off? It made no sense. The moment Hadrian stepped into the sitting room, he felt better. For whatever reason, just the change of room was comforting. No, not comforting. Invigorating. And that was what he needed. He forced himself to walk the perimeter of the room. He grew tired before he finished, but pushed himself to reach the table near the windows. Frustratingly exhausted, he sat and slumped back against the chair. Lifting his hands to his brow, he tried to massage the pain away. It helped. Slightly. "Would you like to break your fast here?" Sharp asked. There was a tentativeness to his question. "That would be agreeable. My apologies, Sharp." Hadrian wiped his hand over his face and straightened. Slowly. "I know I have not been the best patient. There is no need to apologize," Sharp said crisply. "You have suffered a terrible attack. You nearly died." Unfortunately, Sharp was not being overdramatic. Hadrian had nearly died. His assailant had barely missed his liver, and Hadrian would likely not have survived that. But I did not die, thankfully, and I am eager to return to my former activities. Riding in the park, working at Westminster, meeting friends and colleagues at one of his clubs. Why did that all sound boring suddenly? Perhaps because nearly dying made one examine one's life. Was this where Hadrian imagined he'd be at the age of 30? No. He'd expected to be married with an heir and perhaps a spare, or with a bright-eyed daughter he could teach to fish at Ravenswood, his estate in Hampshire. Alas, he was not married and didn't know when he would be. That would require him to actually court someone, and though